I'm Tyler Souters, and you're watching Clean Skies News. In June, the House of Representatives passed the controversial Waxman-Markey ACES Act, which would cap carbon emissions and establish a cap-and-trade system. One analysis after another has emerged regarding both the positives and the negatives of this legislation. The latest piece comes from the National Association of Manufacturers and the American Council for Capital Formation. With us now to talk about that study is Dr. Margo Thorning. She is Senior Vice President and Chief Economist for the ACCF. Margo, good to have you with us today.
Thank you.
Let's start first of all with the parameters and the assumptions you made for this study, because there's such a wide range in terms of demand, costs, even technological assumptions when you're forecasting all the way out to 2030 or 2050.
Yes, we had a low-cost case that assumed 25 new nuclear plants would be built by, or could be built by 2030. Our high-cost case assumed only 10 new nuclear plants. And those are very important assumptions, because the more nuclear that could be put in place, the easier and cheaper it is to comply with emission reduction requirements. We also assumed under our high-cost case that 30 new carbon capture and storage facilities could be built, 15 for coal and 15 for gas. The low-cost case assumed 60 new plants would be built. We assumed that wind and biomass would increase under the high-cost case about 6 gigawatts, or 6 new facilities per year, and under the low-cost case about 15. So all of those assumptions about the new technology are available on the ACCF website. We also made assumptions about how much offsets could be used. Under the Waxman-Markey bill, 2 billion tons a year are allowed to be used as offsets to meet emission reduction targets. We assumed about 1 billion tons per year could be found and verifiable, split 95% domestic, 5% international. We made other assumptions about capital costs. In fact, we used the EIA's capital cost adjustments. All of those assumptions about how quickly new technology can penetrate, what the assumptions were about banking and so forth, are on the website in the executive summary.
Let's get to the meat of the findings here from your study. And I divided into two overall headlines: consumers and economy. Let's start with the consumer's impact. You had said residential electricity rates could rise by up to 50% by the year 2030. Gasoline could go up by 26% in the same time frame.
Yes. Gasoline prices, electricity prices for both households and industrial users, natural gas prices all rise by, especially by 2030, when all the free allowances have been phased out, rise very sharply by between 50 to, in the case of natural gas, as much as 79%. So the impact of this bill gets stronger and stronger after 2020 as the allowances are phased out, especially after 2025. The loss to household income on average is $1,200 in real dollars by 2030 for the U.S. as a whole.
Getting back to the assumptions and variables, though, Margo, what about the fact, and this is just an example to use, but natural gas prices are so depressed right now. What if legislation is enacted in terms of making that a bridge fuel? And so prices change, gasoline is devalued to some degree. My point being, there's so much gray area here.
Yes, well, we are using the EIA baseline forecast, and of course if something did sharply change, that would impact the results. Might make natural gas prices rise even faster if it becomes more of a bridge fuel than it already is. But our assumptions are based on what looks like it's likely in the future. And one thing about our ACCF NAM study is that we've combined a host of variables and run them all at once with the EIA NIMS model, which is different from what EIA does. EIA released their own study last week, which basically allows one or two things to shift at a time and then looks at the overall impact. Interestingly, EIA's last case, not the one that the media generally picks up on, but the one that limits nuclear and limits how quickly new CCS technology will be available, ends up showing the same loss in GDP in 2030 as our study does. So that shows you, when you line up studies and look at assumptions and they're similar, you tend to get similar results.
Well, let's talk about those overall impacts. And GDP is one that you mentioned under the heading of economy. Another is the loss of employment. Again, these are staggering numbers when you look forward to 2030.
Yes, well, GDP, the losses range under the low-cost case, which has the more generous nuclear and CCS assumptions, to between about 1.8% of GDP to as much as 2.4% of GDP compared to the baseline forecast. And that number may not sound like much, but 2.4% of GDP is about, in current dollars, over $600 billion. And over the entire 18-year period that we forecast, the cumulative GDP losses range between about 2.7 and 3.2 trillion dollars. Now think about the impact of that much loss of GDP on federal and state budgets. Every $1 of GDP, 30 cents of it goes to government here in the U.S. So if we lose, say, $3 trillion of gross domestic product over this time period, we've lost $1 trillion in tax receipts. And with state and federal governments struggling to find the money to pay for programs, that's an important policy consideration.
How much would those numbers change in your estimation, Margo, if instead of the particulars of this cap and trade system, there was simply a price put on carbon?
Well, most economists think that putting a price on carbon through a carbon tax is a more efficient way to provide an incentive to companies and households to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It would almost certainly reduce the cost of this program. It would allow companies and households time to change their capital stock in the natural course of events. If they were going to replace a machine tool, they would replace it more toward the end of its depreciable life rather than today, because they would be able to say, well, I'll pay the right to emit a ton of CO2 for the next 3 years, then this machine's going to be obsolete and old and I'll replace it. So it would allow flexibility about when the emission cuts were to take place and make it a cheaper way to proceed.
Margo, final question, and this is a quote that comes from Jay Timmons, who is Executive Vice President with the NAM. Again, it goes back to the issues of assumptions and parameters. He says, quote, China and India have made it clear they have no intention of reducing their own emissions. If China and India do get on board, and I think each country respectively would argue that it is doing its part to cut emissions, does that change the entire forecast regarding not just the cost of Markey, Waxman, and the ACES Act, but the idea of a cap and trade altogether?
Well, if China and India were to accept strong targets to reduce their emissions, which of course they've said they won't do, but if for some reason they did decide to ratchet down energy use, because that's what it would mean for them, they would lose domestic production, reduce their own employment, and put their economies in recession. Now, on the other hand, if they were to do that, that would tend to make U.S. manufacturers at less of a disadvantage, because China would not have that huge price advantage selling into our markets. But that's really not on the table. China and India have made it clear that economic growth is their priority, and energy use is absolutely necessary for that. One thing people forget here in the U.S., over the last decade, each 1% increase in our gross domestic product has been accompanied by a 0.3% increase in energy use. So if we want to get out of this current recession and resume our growth rate, we have to use some more energy to do that.
All right. And the other 35 states will be included in this report sometime over the next week, correct?
In the next week we will post all 35 states, as well as a full report, 50-page report detailing all the nuances of the analysis.
All right. Dr. Margo Thorning is Senior Vice President and Chief Economist with the American Council for Capital Formation. Dr. Thorning, thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
As for the Senate version of climate legislation that we are expecting to emerge at the end of September, Dr. Thorning says she expects substantial changes from the version that passed the House. You're watching Clean Skies News. I'm Tyler Supers.